getting straight into some action on the currency market. After all the talk, we've had action being taken today with intervention coming through from the Japanese. It has triggered an initial fall in the yen. Sustainability and effectiveness of an action like this still in question, though. What's your view?
Morning, Alishia. Yes, and the Bank of Japan surprised markets this morning. They moved their interest rate announcement forward and they kept rates unchanged. But what they did do is make an adjustment to their asset purchase target, which they increased and then intervened in currency markets. So we've seen the yen strengthen quite significantly over the last week, largely on the back of how investors feel about the other currencies, mainly the euro from the EU and the dollar from the US, and the troubles in those regions really playing out in the currencies. So we've seen investors bail into other currencies such as the yen and the Swiss franc, and that's pushed those currencies up to levels that certainly worried their respective policy makers, and we're now seeing action being taken by the Bank of Japan. As far as sustainability is concerned, which you mentioned, it's always a risky strategy for central banks to try and intervene in currencies. At best, they can expect to buy themselves some time, but given the size of global currency flows, it's not likely to make a lasting or sustained impression. So in our view, it's not going to have a lasting impact. What one would really be looking for is to see coordinated action from all of the major central banks, and in that situation, one would be more assured of there being a lasting impact on the currency.
So traders not too nervous at this stage that policymakers are cracking down simultaneously in markets, because this action out of Japan follows the fact that we saw the Swiss National Bank yesterday unexpectedly cut rates on that end to weaken its currency.
Well, certainly there is some talk now that, given the closeness of the two events, that we might actually be seeing coordinated action from these central banks. That isn't our base case scenario. We would still want to see other central banks, such as the Fed or the BOE, also participating to be certain. So certainly it is an interesting question at this point, but we think we'd have to wait and see before making a definitive statement in that regard.
Well, we are awaiting interest rate decisions out of the BOE and ECB a little later this afternoon. Your expectations on those fronts?
Well, we think that both central banks are going to keep their respective benchmark interest rates unchanged. In the UK, we've seen slowing growth. In the second quarter, it slowed quite sharply from the first quarter, and we think that that's going to lend extra weight to the argument against a move in rates at this point. So we see that interest rate unchanged. We also see the asset purchase target remaining unchanged. In the EU, we also see the refi rate remaining unchanged. Inflation has been coming down recently in the EU, but again, that's a counterweight to what we've seen on the growth side, where growth has also been slowing. So on the whole, we expect both central banks to keep their interest rates unchanged. In the EU, because there's a press statement afterwards, we'd be looking for some indication of how President Trichet sees growth panning out in that area, and possibly a softer, more dovish tone from him.
Nomvuyo, implications of all of this on the rand specifically. I mean, we've seen it come off its lows of 6.84 against the dollar yesterday, but still very vulnerable to uncertainty over developments in the European area or territory and the US as well.
Absolutely, Alishia. As always, the rand remains a victim or very vulnerable to changes in sentiment that we've seen. So the rand actually weakened yesterday as global growth concerns came to the fore and started to really weigh on investors' minds. Then we saw it come off a little bit in the afternoon and recover slightly when we had better than expected data coming out from both sides of the Atlantic. So the rand's still very vulnerable to changes in sentiment, and of course changes in sentiment driven by data flow. So if the current data flow continues on a negative trend, we'd expect to see the rand weaken further, perhaps 6.86 or even as far as 6.91 by the end of this week. And of course, the most crucial aspect of this would be how the US unemployment data unfolds tomorrow.